International Relations. My guest today is Anatol Lieven, Director of the Eurasia Program, and Andrew Basevic, Chair in American Diplomatic History at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Been lucky enough to have some of his colleagues on, like Trita Parsi. I encourage you to look at those conversations as well. But in this two-part conversation with Anatol, I was very interested to hear his thoughts, his takes on the ongoing developments in the war with Iran, Russia's role, but also in the second half, more conventionally around Russia and Ukraine. So, Anatol, welcome to the program. It's great to have you on. I think as a start, really, on absolutely, and as we look at, are we having peace? Are we not? The discussions around Russia's role and its relationship to Iran. How are you looking at proceedings right now?
Well, I mean, 5 weeks ago, I thought that Russia probably was moving gradually towards an acceptance of a US compromise over the remaining slice of the Donbass and security guarantees, because the war on the ground has been going badly for Russia. Russian forces have been advancing, but very slowly and with very high casualties. And the Russian economy was in increasing difficulties from inflation, and underlying this from the fall in oil prices, oil and gas prices over the past year. But of course, the Iran war has transformed that. Russia is now making much more from international energy sales. Estimates go up to $250 million a day. And so the financial pressure on Russia has been lifted as long as the war goes on, but as long as the Iran war goes on, to say. But also, there is increasing talk of both the US and European countries having to divert arms supplies, especially air defense systems, from Ukraine to the Middle East to guard against Iranian attacks. And that would seriously weaken the Ukrainian armed forces. Now, these things do not in themselves mean that Ukraine will lose, because contemporary military technology really favors the defensive. And Russia is obviously fighting with a well-paid volunteer army, not with conscripts. So the Russian forces do not outnumber the Ukrainians to anything like the extent that one would assume from Russia's much, much bigger population. But I mean, what this Iran war has done has very much strengthened, for the moment, hardliners in Russia and in the Russian military, who've been advising Putin not to make a compromise, to continue the war, because time is on Russia's side. And I fear that as long as the Iran war goes on, time will be on Russia's side.
It certainly there's that. Oh, there's a bit of background noise there. Certainly there's that concept of strategic patience that the Russians have. But I'm going to focus on the Iranian angle primarily at this moment. How much can Russia really diversify and supply intelligence, or just give attention to resources to the situation between the Americans and Iran when they are quite overstretched in Ukraine?
Well, intelligence Russia can give. It has plenty of satellite intelligence that it can pass on to Iran. That is not, and electronic intelligence, that's not affected by the war in Ukraine. What is affected, of course, is weapon supplies. And obviously, the Iranians have a considerable moral claim on Russia because Iran provided Russia with large numbers of Shahed drones, which Russia has upgraded and is now, it seems, giving back to the Ukrainians, though possibly not in huge numbers yet. But also, of course, when it comes to providing intelligence and weapons to Iran, certainly Russian soldiers would think they had every right to do that, because after all, US weapons and US intelligence have been critical to Ukraine's fight, and indeed to Ukraine's ability to kill a considerable number of senior Russian officers. So, Russia has a considerable incentive to do that. But on the other hand, up to now at least, the Russian government has been very anxious to try to keep, good relations with Trump. Both in the hope that Trump would eventually deliver a peace deal in Ukraine, which would satisfy Russia's minimum demands, but also, of course, to divide the Trump administration from Europe. But with this war and Russian disappointment with Trump administration policies, over the past year, confidence in Trump may be fading, and Russia may feel it can take more risks in this regard in order to keep the Iran war going. I'm sure, though, that the Russians are also consulting very closely with the Chinese about this. The Chinese so far have been very cautious, very prudent in not supplying Iran with weapons. But of course, if the war goes on and the rise in energy prices and energy shortages and fertilizer shortages really begin to hit the Chinese economy, one could imagine the Chinese beginning to do this as well, or at least threatening to do so, in an effort to get the Americans to stop. Because of course, if the Chinese, because they're not involved in a war, if the Chinese were to really supply Iran with weapons and intelligence, you'd have half a dozen American warships at the bottom of the sea. And of course, also, they only have to make some kind of demonstration against Taiwan, not an actual invasion or attack, but just a serious demonstration, which would hugely distract the American Navy from the Middle East. Now, as I say, I don't think China wants to do that, but if the war goes on, the pressure on China to do that will rise, and then, of course, it will do that in coordination with Russia.
So I want to ask you a bit more about the Russia relationship in a moment, but just on the Chinese angle, do you think that this is a case of benevolent neutrality from Beijing when it comes to Iran?
Well, I wouldn't exactly call it benevolent. I mean, it's prudent. The Chinese do not want a clash with the United States, and obviously, I mean, if they openly started supplying Iran with weapons to kill American servicemen, relations with the US would plummet. I think something also to note here, however, in this regard is, there has been a lot of, well, not just loose, but I mean deliberately, I think, mendacious talk of this so-called alliance of autocracies, or axis of authoritarians between China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. There is no alliance. Neither Russia nor China are bound by a treaty to come to Iran's defense. China is not bound by treaty to supply Iran. But by the way, I mean, China doesn't have a treaty in that sense with anybody. It doesn't have it even with Pakistan. The point is, partnership is not alliance. This, after all, has been critical to the war in Ukraine. America is an ally in NATO of Poland. If Poland is attacked, then America has a legal obligation to come to its defense. I mean, of course, whether it would honor that, we don't know, but at least that is, but of course, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and so whatever the media may say, Ukraine is not an ally of the United States, and Iran is not an ally of China. But
no, they're not.
Of course,
No, I'm just saying that I don't think they are. So there's a minor delay on the recording software that we use, so I hope it doesn't come off as I'm inherently interrupting you, Anatol. I just wanted to build on what you said there, because I think a lot of people look at this. One academic I remember interviewing has called it the axis of upheaval. So there's lots of different terms for this sort of idea of these nation states that work together. But as I've always emphasized, China isn't the same as North Korea, Iran, or Russia. There's that infamous cover by The Economist from a couple of years ago where the four heads of state are sort of standing side by side and they're discussing these four. But China's different. It's some people say it's a status quo power and doesn't want to usurp the international system or be a rogue state, as Western nations call them, in the same way. But to just bring in the Russian angle with Iran specifically,
hang on a second. Who are the rogue states at the moment?
Well, that's what the Western academics would say, is that it's the Russians, the Iranians, and the Koreans are rogue. But right now, it's the Americans.
I am an objective analyst, and there is no question who are the rogue states at the moment and the states that are causing upheaval. And it is the United States and Israel. I mean, even Russia has not sought upheaval for its own sake. You know, Russia has never tried to cause trouble for its own sake. It has done it in defense of what it sees as its vital national interests. And, you know, for that matter, if you go back over the past, well, almost 30 years by now, you know, which countries have caused most upheaval in the Middle East? United States in Iraq, Israel repeatedly, and of course the British, French, and American destruction of the Libyan state, which has not only destabilized a large part of northwestern Africa, but has also, of course, released a flood of migrants into Europe, which is radically destabilizing European politics. Now, none of that had anything to do with Russia, nothing at all. It was us.
No, as I say, this wasn't me trying to sort of disagree. I agree with you actually very much. Certainly, the Russians have been less active in the Middle East in recent years for different reasons, and it is the Trump administration's desire to sort of go after the Islamic Republic and Israel's incessant desire to, well, defend themselves or act out of what they consider existentialism. So no, I certainly agree with you. I was more just trying to argue it from, or frame it to you. But simply then about the Russia-Iranian relationship bilaterally, because in a lot of people's eyes, these two are actually the closest of the various nations we've mentioned thus far, because they're the ones that are most willing to act on the beliefs or perceptions they have about the international system as it is, versus China, which is a little bit more complex, or as you said, reluctant or cautious. So with that in mind, though, how transactional is that relationship between the Iranians and Russians? Because I feel like the Russians have kind of left the Iranians out to dry a little bit.
No, I mean, it's always been transactional on both sides. I mean, the Iranians, you know, have very bitter memories of Russian aggression in the 19th century. I mean, of course, they have the same bitter memories of British aggression more recently. But, you know, there is no natural affinity between the sort of quasi-theocratic regime in Iran and Putin's Russian nationalism. I mean, all there is, as you said, is a common hostility to the United States. But you know, the Russia, from its point of view, has never attacked the United States. You know, the Russians always say, look, you know, after the end of the Cold War, and Putin, for, you know, really his first 8 years in power, was very anxious for good relations with the United States, as long as the United States, you know, did not expand NATO to Ukraine and Georgia, and respected what Putin, and by the way, Yeltsin before him, saw as Russian vital interests. And, you know, the Iranians have not attacked American targets directly for many, many years now. You know, Israel, of course, is another matter, or at least via Hezbollah. But you know, it's very important to note this. You know, this Iran war is not a defensive war on the part of the US.
Interesting. No, okay. So when it comes to the dynamics there, I think it's transactional. But considering how far the Iranians have gone to support the Russians in Ukraine, I'm still a little bit confused that they aren't going further to support the Iranians. I guess Putin doesn't care who runs Tehran as long as it's someone who can support them tacitly, or as long as Russia benefits by selling greater oil to China. Is there no love lost between them?
Well, but I mean, the question is what Russia can do. Um, you know, I mean, as you said, as long as it's fighting a war in Iran, sorry, in Ukraine, Russia does not have a huge number of weapons to give. It is giving some. But also, you know, if obviously, I mean, what Russia has to fear, has always feared, is that the Americans will vastly increase their support to Ukraine, or even, you know, in some way involve America directly. Now, you know, if you get obviously Russian missiles sinking American warships, then that is how America will retaliate, and Russia has to be obviously very worried about that. So, you know, since they are not treaty allies, yes, I mean Russia's help to Iran will be limited by what Putin sees as, you know, Russian vital interests, as I mean the other way around as well. You know, Iran was paid by Russia, you know, paid very well to supply Russia with Shahed missiles for the war in Ukraine, but Iran did not send troops, even volunteers, to fight for Russia. So yeah, I mean it's a kind of partnership, but one with limits. But as I say, I mean this could change. If this war goes on, and the Russians lose any hope of American help in a peace deal in Ukraine, and if China gets involved, because up to now, I think I don't know, but I would imagine from my previous conversations with the Chinese that the Chinese will have been telling the Russians also to be cautious, you know, and prudent. In part because, of course, the Chinese now depend even more heavily on Russian energy provision to China, and so I mean, they do not want a war between Russia and the United States that would also, you know, wreck the Russian economy. But as I say, I mean, it depends on how long this war goes on and what the pressure on the Chinese economy is. But also, of course, you know, this war is a colossal diplomatic boon to China. You know, because of especially its you know, claims in the South China Sea. You know, in previous years, China really, you know, quite alarmed several of its neighbors, including the Philippines. Well, now, you know, the Philippines has declared a state of energy emergency. Countries all over Asia, including India, are coming on under huge and increasing pressure over their energy, but also their fertilizer. You know, this is something which was not noticed before the war. I was not aware of it to this extent. But the Gulf is an absolutely critical provider of fertilizer to the world. 80% of India's fertilizer apparently comes from the Gulf. Now, you know, this could have a crippling effect on agriculture across Asia. And of course, you know, when you start really affecting agriculture, you affect food prices. When you affect food prices, you stir up domestic discontent against governments. So you see, China obviously now sees a way of overcoming the suspicions of its Asian neighbors and, you know, rallying them behind China against the United States. And, you know, the longer the war goes on and the deeper the energy crisis becomes, the stronger China's hand will be. And, you know, if China felt that it could intervene not intervene directly in Iran, but really support Iran with weapons with the approval of most of Asia, or even just to threaten to do so in order to force the Americans to stop the war, well, I can imagine that could be quite appealing to the Chinese government. And it could well be that the threat alone would be enough, because obviously, I mean, if China really opened the floodgates of weapons, Iran's ability to hit not just Israel and the American bases, but American warships would be hugely increased.
I want to ask you one more point about the Russia-Iranian dynamic, but just on China for a second. I appreciate a lot of what you're saying, but do you not think you're being over optimistic or overestimating the capability of the Chinese? They haven't been involved in a significant military conflict since the 1960s. Their navy has not been tested. And regardless of what the situation is with other Asian countries right now, we know the relationship the Philippines have with China over the various pressures, maritime threats the Chinese have been doing, Coast Guard and interactions like that. India and China aren't exactly best friends. So how much do you think that China can really leverage that?
Well, I mean, China is not going to go to war with America directly over Iran. It's going to provide weapons and intelligence. But given China's stock of weapons and given China's immense industrial potential when it comes to generating weapons, undoubtedly it can hugely strengthen the Iranian forces. Can you imagine America trying to conduct, as Trump is now threatening, a land operation in Iran, actually having troops on the ground, faced with an enormous barrage of Chinese missiles? Think of the casualties there. But as I say, I mean, at the moment, up to now, you're quite right. I mean, most of Asia is very suspicious of China. But if a few months down the line, most of Asia thinks that America and Israel are wrecking their economies, which China has never done, that could change.
No, of course, it's an important point. I just wonder about the battle testedness, if that's a word, or battle readiness of the weapons, right? That's why, nearly a year ago now, gosh, when we had that May confrontation or a border exchange between the Pakistanis and Indians, and there was a lot of interest by Western intelligence, if I remember, about some of the jets that Pakistan used, because it was the first time that the Chinese hardware had been used. And so the French particularly were quite interested to see how it went up against some of their systems that were supplying India. So that was more just that point. But on Russia and Iran, if this sharing of intelligence is as significant or at high level as some media has suggested, how far can Moscow go? What is the line they can take before that risks escalation with the United States or alienation of Trump? Putin wants to have Trump on the good side so that Russia can be brought back into the economy and sanctions relief, etc. So how far can Moscow go?
I can't say for sure, but of course, it also depends on what the Iranians hit. So far they have not been able to hit any American warships or inflict serious casualties on the Americans. I mean, so far the Iranian leverage has been indirect. It has been obviously about closing the Straits of Hormuz and hitting or threatening to hit the energy infrastructure of the Gulf. But if the Iranians got lucky and actually did inflict heavy casualties on the Americans, then you could well see the Trump administration going crazy. And of course, if they saw that as having been done by a Russian weapon with Russian intelligence, then there would be a huge backlash against Russia. But on the other hand, what you have to remember is that America, has faced significant difficulties since the war in Ukraine began in manufacturing enough of various kinds of weapons, including air defense systems, to cover Ukraine and Israel and its own forces. And of course, the Iran war has hugely intensified that problem. So there is obviously the question of whether the US would be able greatly to intensify its supplies to Ukraine. The other thing, of course, to keep in mind, as everyone has said, is that these American air defense systems, missiles, are colossally expensive. Is it $3 million for an interceptor to intercept an Iranian or Russian drone costing $50,000? America is a lot richer than Iran, richer than Russia, but that is a pretty unequal balance.
No, absolutely. a Shahed drone costs about $20,000, and an interceptor costs about $4 million. So what is that? That's a 200% difference, or whatever, 200 increase. So
2000. You mean 2000? 2000. It's 2000.
I can't do the math. Yes, no. Well, this isn't a math podcast. It's a significant difference, but more importantly, actually, Marissa, is that it's you often have to use more than one interceptor to take down one projectile to ensure that the projectile is damaged to a significant amount. I don't know if that applies as well to drones as such, but the point is, to your emphasis, that the sustainability of this is mad. And the Iranians are able to churn out these drones in a high level production in a way that the Americans don't. It's a backlog. And I guess this kind of brings me to your perspective, how Russia looks at this, because there's a lot of emphasis. I made it on a news appearance just a few days ago, that Trump doesn't have a plan, or if they do have one, it's changing not by the day, but seemingly by the hour. There was that clip I think Trump had of being asked point blank, because he's talking about the peace talks being successful and they're making progress. And then the reporters says, well, what about the 200 billion then? And Trump pauses more. And then he just says, well, it's nice to have it, isn't it? So when you're, from the Russian perspective, Putin, what is he thinking when he hears that? When he sees that, does he just look at Trump and think, oh, I can manipulate this guy, I can take advantage of this for my interests elsewhere around the world, even more than I thought? Or take me through what you think.
Well, I can tell you what I think. Remember, I can't. I don't know what Putin is thinking. He hasn't told me. I'm not sure what Trump is thinking, because he may not be thinking at all. But he also hasn't told me. But obviously, this attack on Iran is advantageous for Russia. It is advantageous militarily. It's advantageous economically, but also it's advantageous in diplomatic and, one could say, moral terms. Yesterday the German president Steinmeier made a speech in which he was putting the US-Israeli attack on Iran and the Russian attack on Ukraine basically in the same category. Now that previously would have been unheard of, but it is how more and more people around the world, even in Europe, are seeing this. Of course, that means that even in Europe, more and more people are likely to say, well, we've now, it's no longer a question of morality or rules-based order or international law. We've just got to look after our own interests, and our interests involve getting access again to cheap Russian energy. There is more and more talk of that, obviously, in Europe. Now, it hasn't by any means become dominant, and in most countries, the establishments are holding out against it. But it is a pretty obvious way to go. And of course, Russian energy is so much cheaper than what they're getting from the United States.
Yes, it is. How much do you think that this whole situation with America and its impact on Europe specifically is sort of Trump's elongated, convoluted way of trying to ensure dominance over energy provision to Europe? There's a lot of speculation about who blew up the pipeline, and this emphasis that America has been trying to do so because they want Europe to buy their more expensive LNG, conversely to Russia's gas provisions. I mean, it's obviously speculative, conspiracy related to that. People claim conspiracy. What's your take on that?
Yes, I think that's entirely plausible. But of course, one should say that this took place under the Biden administration first, not under Trump. But yes, I mean, making Europe dependent on US energy and getting lots of profit from those sales, makes excellent sense from America's point of view, not from Europe's. Now, of course, the other reason that's being given for this war, and I'm not sure whether it was actually true or whether this has been generated by Trump supporters in an effort, to find a reason for what otherwise increasingly looks like a disastrous war. But, there are more and more people on the Trump side writing that the real point of this is to cut off China's energy supplies and gain leverage over China. Well, I mean, the problem about that is, of course, that the Chinese are not stupid, and they will invest much more in Russian energy production, and they will do what they're doing already, which is invest much more in alternative energy and electrification. But also, I mean, if that is the Trump strategy, well, I mean, even if it isn't, even if this war was launched without any reference to China, I mean, what it shows is, and what has been noticed, across Asia, is an utter indifference or contempt for the economies and the vital interests of American allies and partners. For years now, Republican and Democratic administrations, have been devoting so much attention to wooing India. Now they are. Trump has basically set out, or no, that's not his intention, but the collateral damage is a dire threat to Indian agriculture and the Indian economy.
So shifting this to Europe as well, obviously about Ukraine and the situation down there. We've touched upon it intermittently during the conversation, Anatol, but where do you think this puts Ukraine? There's a lot of emphasis that, if Zelensky can leverage this correctly, then Ukraine can be a core consultant or provider of information, security guarantor, some people even called it, over drones and these drone interceptors. How likely do you think that is?
Well, I mean, Ukraine doesn't have any weapons to give. It can't, obviously. It needs them itself. No, I mean, what Ukraine has been giving to the US is the benefit of its experience, its expertise in shooting down Russian missiles and drones. And that seems to have been, quite useful. But it is, it's a secondary thing. It's not vital. And as far as Europe is concerned, well, unless the Europeans intervene directly in Ukraine or start actually blockading Russia by sea, Russia is not looking to attack Europe. You're not going to have a barrage of missiles and drones directed at Europe. So, Ukrainian help there is basically irrelevant. No, I mean, I think that I think that this Iran war puts Ukraine in much greater danger. How much we'll have to see. The situation on the battlefield has repeatedly surprised us, they managed to beat off a pretty major Russian assault 2 weeks ago. Maybe they will continue to do so, but clearly the Iran war has increased the odds against them.
But there's the emphasis that Well, okay, I'll reframe it. So there's growing argument about how intertwined these conflicts are now. Do you still see them as separate theatres, or are they largely sort of part of a broader struggle between Western or American interests and sort of the anti-American blocs, right? The front lines of Ukraine versus the hotspots across the Middle East.
Well, I mean, so far they're separate because Russian help to Iran has been limited on the one hand, and on the other hand, of course, NATO countries have refused to intervene on the American and Israeli side in the Gulf, despite what Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, says. All NATO countries except Estonia have refused to do that. So no, I mean these conflicts are still separate. One can imagine how they could become merged, but I myself I don't see that happening. Well, what's quickly? I mean, I don't see that happening, shall we say, in the next fortnight or month. And as I say, I think it would depend heavily on the Chinese. I very much doubt that Russia would take that risk in Iran vis-a-vis the United States unless it actually felt it had, or knew it had, full Chinese backing, because the risks for Russia would be enormous. I mean, if now, of course, this would create big risks for the United States if it were to send the US Air Force into Ukraine. Huge risks for the United States, including, of course, of nuclear war. But on the other hand, in purely conventional terms, if the US Air Force intervened in Ukraine, the Ukrainians would win. Or at least, I mean, further Russian advances would become completely impossible. And, the Russians have to worry about that. Now, they would, of course, retaliate in terrifying ways against NATO in Europe, but they don't want to do that. The Russians don't want to escalate this war into a general war. It's the last thing they want to do. They want to keep it confined to Ukraine and win it in Ukraine.
So we've talked about in the past who has the momentum, which side seems to be winning. I personally try to avoid such binary interpretations, but well, the media is less inclined. But you could argue a few months ago the Ukrainians had the momentum, but it seems to have pivoted now, relatively speaking, back to Moscow with how Russia's benefiting from the war in Iran. They're making how much, hundreds of millions a day because of the war and the oil revenue and such. Do you think the Russians have the strategic momentum now? And if so, is that able to translate onto the battlefield on the tactical level?
I mean, they have, yeah, I mean, they obviously have momentum, but on the effects of the battlefield, or whether those, I mean, there will be effects, but whether they will be decisive, I just don't know. I cannot say. The other thing, though, to keep in mind is, and I think the whole Western discourse on this has been, well, at least the European one, has been profoundly wrong. It's that if the war stopped now, even if Ukraine gave up this last small part of the Donbass to Russia, this, I'm absolutely certain, would be seen by historians as a Ukrainian victory. It's already seen by Russian hardliners as a Ukrainian victory, and that's why they're so much against peace along present lines. Because, look, as you know as well as I do, it's not just that when Putin launched this war, he wanted to turn the whole of Ukraine into a client state. That was Plan A. Plan B was to capture the whole of eastern and southern Ukraine, what the Russians call Novorossiya. Both of to date, I mean, both of those agendas have failed. Russia has gained only a fraction of the territory it hoped to gain, and of course, far from being subjugated. I mean, Ukrainian nationalism and Ukraine's links to the West have been enormously strengthened. But it's not just that. Look, past 400 years now, 500 years, until well, I mean, you can discuss the Zaporozhian Cossacks, but until a few years ago, the entire history of Ukraine was to be dominated by Russia, Poland, and Austria, but mostly, of course, Russia, and obviously then incorporation into the Soviet Union. So, an independent Ukraine holding 80% of its national territory, all its, core ethnic territory, very heavily armed and anti-Russian. I mean, objectively speaking, obviously it's not a complete Ukrainian victory, but Ukraine can't win a complete victory, never could. But it is nonetheless a Ukrainian victory and a Russian defeat at present. Now, of course, if now, as you say, I mean, the momentum does transfer itself to the battlefield and Russia makes much greater gains, then of course things will look different. But as of today, this is a Ukrainian victory.
Wow, I wasn't quite expecting that from you. I wasn't.
But why not? Look, you know the history, right? What has been the history of the last 400 years?
Relevant to yourself, I think not. But I mean, I appreciate the compliment. I more just meant in the sense of a definitive suggestion of that. I mean, yes, you could argue relative to what many people expected, Ukraine has done the remarkable. But on this point, some people who are heavily in Camp Ukraine emphasize that if we just gave them everything more and hadn't been so delayed in our provisions of Patriots, of Abrams, and all this element, right, that Ukraine could have an outright victory. And as it stands, regardless of what Russia does, it's going to be a Pyrrhic victory for them because of the amount of losses they've taken and the lack of territory they have to prove for it. You don't think that that's worth doing, and you think that Ukraine should sort of accept the territorial concessions as they are to preserve the country as it is?
Well, I mean, the only territorial concessions that are now being talked about is this about 2,000 square miles of the northwestern Donbass. The rest of it is not a concession because Russia controls it. The only question is, can Ukraine reconquer it? And the obvious answer is no, because all the contemporary military technology, drones above all, but drones, mines, satellite intelligence, that favor the defense, favor Ukraine when Ukraine is on the defensive, but favor Russia when Russia is on the defensive. I mean, remember, the only time when greatly increased Western help, I mean, once again, unless the West had intervened directly, could actually have helped the Ukrainians to win, was in the summer and autumn of 22. By the summer of 23, the Russians had built up their own defensive lines. As we know, the Ukrainians launched a major offensive, but they could not break through. And I mean, there are 2 points here. The first is, how do you get produce a Ukrainian defeat? Well, one way a much bigger Ukrainian defeat. One obvious way to do that is to persuade the Ukrainians to attack and attack and attack, use up men that they do not have, use up equipment, and then the Russians counterattack. So that's one aspect of it. But the other thing is, there was all this, hysterical talk in the West about Russia, the Russian nuclear threat. I mean, the Russian nuclear threat was always in order to put pressure on the West not to intervene directly in Ukraine. That was the point of it. It wasn't bluster for the sake of bluster. But the only time, and the former head of the CIA, Bill Burns, under Biden, said this publicly. The only time that the CIA was actually becoming seriously worried about the possibility of Russian nuclear use was when it briefly seemed that the Ukrainians might threaten the Crimea, because that is so important to Russia, that Russia would, run almost any risk to keep it. And, as Russians have said to me, look, If you threatened to take Pearl Harbor away from the United States, the US would resort to nuclear war, undoubtedly, if it had to. If you try to take Sevastopol away from us, we will resort to nuclear war. So, I mean, the point is, you know, I mean, this is an absolutely central flaw of Western thinking, and has been for many years. It was, you know, the whole business of the expansion of NATO was based on the assumption that Russia could not react. Well, 500,000 dead say differently.
Yeah, I had a very interesting conversation with the well, now he's the head of the Russian mission to the OSCE, Dmitry Polyansky. So I encourage people watching and listening to keep a lookout for that. Interesting conversation, difficult one in some ways, but enlightening nonetheless. And Anatol, I guess in our sort of my last couple of questions for you as we begin to wrap up for this session, but I'd love to have you back. I think it would be nice to have a deeper dive on Ukraine and Russia explicitly. You know, look, I understand a lot of what you're saying. I have my reservations about NATO expansionism. I have a lot of criticisms of Western foreign policy, but you know, at the end of the day, also people will argue that NATO have been expanding, encroaching on Russia's national interests or sphere of influence, but they didn't invade Russia. Russia did invade Ukraine, and we can also debate around the, you know, the idea of Ukraine as a nation state. I think it's pretty clear that the people, the nation idea, nationhood of Ukrainians is centuries old. The physical state, okay, you know, you can argue about the exact territorial borders of it, but the point is that Russia should not have done what it did on February 24th, because it leads to where we are now.
I entirely agree. And I denounced the Russian invasion as soon as it happened, as did the Quincy Institute. We are on the record as describing the invasion as completely unjustified and illegal. Moreover, we support sanctions against Russia. Of course, as long as the sanctions don't do more damage to us than they do to the Russians, obviously. Our point about sanctions, though, is that they should be directed as to, you know, to be fair, the Trump administration has been doing, but the Europeans haven't, that the sanctions are not something, you know, good in themselves. They are meant to have the purpose of bringing about a peace settlement. You know, as good a peace settlement as one can get. Yeah, I think, you know, that has been Trump's policy. And until this Iran war, I think it was indeed to a considerable extent working. You can see how, you know, Russia being unable to win on the ground or win more on the ground, suffering, you know, increasing economic problems. Russia was scaling back its demands. You know, the Russians had agreed Ukraine can be in the European Union. They'd agreed Ukraine can have a basically unlimited size of armed forces, both of which things they'd previously been resisting. They gave up the claim to the whole of Zaporozhye and Kherson. They gave up the bar on Western military supplies to Ukraine. So yeah, I mean, economic pressure was working, but there's no good saying that economic pressure was going to persuade Russia to withdraw from Ukraine, because it wasn't. That is simply politically impossible for Putin or any other Russian government. And the only way to drive Russia out of Ukraine is if we, NATO, go to war with Russia, which every NATO government, except possibly the Estonians, has ruled out. Both Biden and Trump and Starmer and Merz and everybody, because we don't want to risk nuclear war, and nuclear war is what we would be risking.
I guess, you know, this makes me want to unpack also Russia's internal dealings, but I'm going to save that for a separate conversation. I think this was a nice, broad introductory session with you. And as I said, I'd love to have you back on a regular basis or on a periodical basis to unpack recent developments and connect them to more historical elements as well. But I guess my penultimate question for you, Anatol, is simply, what does this tell us about the state of Europe? This is a pro-European channel. I'm a Europeanist. I believe in the future of Europe or the potential of Europe, but I'm not shy to critique it and recognize the many shortcomings and limitations of it. And in the case of Ukraine or in Iran and more broadly, like what should Europe be doing? Should we be rearming? How much can we emphasize or exercise, excuse me, strategic autonomy? How do you look at it as someone who's obviously studied and worked across the continent as well as outside it?
Well, I think the first thing to say, is that if we really learned, and I count myself as a European as well, although of course I'm British and now working in America, if we really sat down and learned the lessons of the Ukraine war, and if we are aiming at a purely defensive strategy against Russia, once again, the role of drones, mines, satellite intelligence, and of course, yes, artillery and anti-aircraft system, air defense systems, certainly, give us the ability to build up defensive lines against Russia that Russia simply could not break. With all the wealth of Europe behind it. And we can do that at a much lower cost than what people are now talking about, whether they will actually be able to do this. But of course, part of the problem is that our military-industrial complex and our, inertia of Western militaries means that it looks as if we're going to be spending a lot of money on very expensive, but basically unnecessary armaments. Tanks have proved astonishingly ineffective in this war, yet the Germans are talking about making more and more tanks. Fighter aircraft have played a much lower role. Attack helicopters have played no role at all because they were wiped from the skies by anti-aircraft systems in the first fortnight. So, if we can build up European defenses that are quite adequate to defend NATO and the European Union within its existing borders. Of course, if we decide to go to war in Ukraine or promise to defend Ukraine, that's a different matter. But I strongly believe in European rearmament. I think we've allowed our armed forces to decline, to a dangerous extent. But there's an intelligent and a stupid way of doing this, and there is also an efficient and wasteful way of doing it. But the second thing, of course, is you've got to have defenses against Russia, yes, but you also have got to aim, as Bart de Wever, the Prime Minister of Belgium, has said, you've got to try for a peace settlement with Russia and the normalization of relations. Because one thing that the Iran war has made very clear is that Europe desperately needs to be able to distance itself from US and Israeli agendas in the Middle East and US agendas elsewhere, which are not merely have nothing to do with the interests of Europe, but which are absolutely categorically against the interests of Europe. Now, as long as we are terrified of Russia, no European government can do that because they will always be dragged back to dependence on the United States because they will be terrified that they will not be able to resist Russian pressure. I mean, look, the Europeans could end this war, the Iran attack on Iran, tomorrow. Just have to do two things: A, do what the Spanish have done, and say no US, as long as this war continues, no US use of bases in Europe. Ramstein closed, Naples closed. At that point, the US would find it not impossible, but much, much more difficult to resupply and refuel its forces in the Middle East. And the second thing is total economic sanctions against Israel, end of trade with Israel. It's a very minor part of European trade, but I think its imports are 38% of Israeli imports, and exports to Europe are 47%. Cripple the Israeli economy. Tell them, stop now, or the bazooka, as it's called, the trade bazooka, comes in against Israel, and the war would stop. But of course, as we know, no European government is going to do that, because in part, well, partly it's just obviously inherited deference to the Americans, but it's also because they're too terrified of Russia. So for Europe to retain, to regain autonomy, which is not just military autonomy, I mean, the whole point is to have political, diplomatic autonomy, you've got to be sufficiently armed against Russia, but you also have to have normalized relations with Russia. Otherwise, we're stuck with the Americans.
My emphasis is diversification, no over-reliance on any one party, be them China's big markets, Russian cheap energy, or America's security provisions. Europe needs to exercise its capacity to be independent and autonomous. And I think that use of smart power, to reference Joseph Nye, the combination of soft and hard power is Europe's potential. But we seem to be very complacent or unwilling to take those steps. As a final quick fire question for you, Anatol, in a simple, sentence or two, how would you emphasize a realistic settlement? What would it look like today if the Ukrainians and Russians got around the table?
Look, I always said that the war has to end where the front line runs. That doesn't mean legally recognizing Russian control of the territory it holds, but it does de facto. I support the Trump administration's attempt at a compromise over the northwestern Donbass, demilitarization, free trade zone, something like that. We have to have the right in the West to arm the Ukrainians, but maybe without long-range missiles that can hit Moscow. I think that's a concession we can make. Ukraine has to be free, as the Russians have agreed, to join the European Union. Now, if it can join the European Union, that's a different matter. And of course, NATO membership has to be ruled out, because otherwise the Russians simply will not agree. And actual Western troops in Ukraine have to be ruled out, because the Russians will never agree otherwise. But we can, and sanctions have to be suspended, but with a snapback clause. In other words, if Russia resumes aggression against Ukraine, the sanctions come back. We can stockpile over time huge amounts of weapons, not in Ukraine, but in Europe, with the absolutely formal public commitment that these will go to Ukraine if Russia resumes its aggression. So, I mean, given given some intelligent and flexible thinking, I think we can secure Ukraine within its existing de facto borders. Because, I mean, look, people always say, what is the deterrent to Russia to starting this war again? Well, the entire army with which Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022 has been destroyed. Men, equipment, everything. Russia, we don't know for sure, but I mean, I find 250,000 dead entirely plausible. As I say, until the Iran war came, the Russian economy was, I mean, it had taken a long time, but it was suffering badly. Now, look, if that isn't a disincentive to a Russian government to restart the war, what on earth is?
Quite the sentiment to end on there, Anatol, and a lot of food for thought, a lot of things to ponder and to pick up when we have you on next time, hopefully very soon. For everyone watching, if you enjoyed the conversation, then do subscribe, do like the video, do follow the podcast if you're listening to this, and we shall see you all in the next episode.